Yes, hello everyone. I thought I would just briefly show my face so that you could at least put a face to the name. My name is Benda Hofmeyer and I'm affiliated to University of Pretoria in South Africa. So I'm speaking to you from a long way away, but luckily, thanks to COVID, I think we can be in the same room together. I'm going to share my screen. How do you want me to start? Okay, I'm going to talk about the parasites of innovation, the dual models of neoliberal urban creativity, which actually fits better into the next session on neoliberal cities. But let me first tell you what I aim to do. Okay, on the eve of the globalized and globalizing neoliberal turn, Ernest Mandel insisted that the city of late capitalism has become a pliable scientific object readily submitted to technical operations and rationalization procedures, streamlining its efficient functioning. Therein, he unwittingly anticipated the new liberal dream of the creative city. More recently, Mark Schoenberg and Alex de Jong argue in their 2006 Mediapolis that the limits of today's city are expanding well beyond the urban into the domain of visual culture. Urban matter no longer consists in the concrete, but in the creative. In my inquiry into the precise sense in which urban matter has come to be defined in terms of creativity, I take the creative city as case in point, arguing that the concrete and the creative are not mutually exclusive, but rather parallel universes, manned by the formal creative class and informal career workers, respectively. Both incarnate the new liberal agenda, but while the former serves as conduit exacerbating its deleterious effects, the latter suffer at the hands of these effects. I shall start with a brief introduction of the paradoxical notion of a factitious or cultivated creativity and the linkages that the architects of the creative economy try to establish between creativity and the city. Thereafter, I will critically unpack the dual models of neoliberal urban creativity, the formal model and the informal model, before briefly touching about the crucial question of resistance. So while creativity is usually associated with spontaneity, with the imagination, innovation, invention, and the inception of original ideas, the creative city is about malleability, but how and to what extent the creative city can be created. Of course, the ambition of cities to be transformed into creative cities run the risks of turning into the opposite. A local or regional policy implemented using a standardized strategic toolkit, as suggested by the subtitle of Charles Landry's 2000 book, The Creative City, a Toolkit for Urban Innovators, is about a top-down artificial integration of creativity into the planning and governance of cities, rather than a bottom-up spontaneous flourishing of the imagination. It is nevertheless argued that a creative city can be generated, producing the right conditions to foster the existing creative potential and to attract what is lacking. Creativity is presented as the panacea for turning slumping cities into booming cities. It is argued that creativity is the driving force behind a flourishing economy, and this creative economy is inextricably linked to a tolerant and diverse urban environment. The usurpation of creativity by the neoliberal variant of capitalism fits nicely into what Mandel's and subsequently Frederick Jameson's insistence that late capitalism is characterized by the infiltration of capital into areas previously outside of commodity production. This is exemplified by Florida's contention that booming cities are those that cultivate their alternative or countercultural circuit. That is their bohemian, gay, or whatever wayward wiles, which leads to his insistence upon tolerance, diversity, and openness. Tolerance and safety foster contact and creative cross-pollination. Such an urban climate is highly desirable because, as Jane Jacobs in The Economy of Cities and Peter Hall in The Cities of Civilization point out, cities are the main engines of the economy. Creativity in Landry and, um, and Florida should therefore be understood in the broadest possible sense of the word. Apart from art, design, and architecture, it adds surplus value to almost any consumer product or aspect of consumer society. It is therefore not limited to the visual and performing arts, but encompasses more fundamentally the creative processes in organizations. Creativity is supposedly an inexhaustible raw material that is available to everyone. Some are, of course, more privy to creativity than others. Artistic and cultural producers, designers, architects, and young and upcoming professionals would be more creative than factory workers. But as factory labor migrates to faraway low-wage countries and the industrial age wanes, vacant industrial sites were rediscovered and repurposed as magnets for creativity, also as a way to ward off undesirable squatting by vagrants. Think, for example, of the defunct gasworks factory in Amsterdam that stopped production in 1967, that was reinvented as part of the Culture Park Westergasfabriek in 2003, which is now a vibrant creative hub. Another striking example is the High Line, the repurposed elevated railway in New York City that has been described as becoming an engine of neoliberalism. Originally, the mile-and-a-half, around 2 kilometer long railway line, elevated 9 meters above the meatpacking district and Chelsea neighborhood in West Manhattan, was used by freight trains servicing Manhattan with meat, dairy, and other produce before the structure was deserted as the trucking industry expanded and businesses relocated. As the railways had come to nature, engulfed by unkept vines and wildflowers, the derelict structure became a fitting representation of post-industrial United States. Following the intervention by what Florida would call the super creative core of the creative class, that is, architects, landscape architects, and garden designers, 15 years later, the neighborhood bears little resemblance to its dingy past life, having swapped butcher coats for haute couture, appearing to affirm Florida's prophecy that creativity paves the way for profit and hence urban regeneration. Above on the High Line itself, hipster crowds relish the coolness afforded by water features and bask in the sun on reclaimed teak park benches amidst the expansive incorporation of green space, while enjoying eats from an array of cosmopolitan food stalls. Everywhere along the High Line's length, scaffolding has sprouted, announcing the imminent erection of new developments, which already include pricey high-end apartments and designer penthouses. Florida appears to defend a rather broad and inclusive definition of the so-called creative class, not limited to members of the super creative core that attract other members, architects and garden designers attracting fashion designers, but also creative professionals or knowledge workers that do problem solving for a living on a high level of education, based on a high level of education and human capital, and gravitate towards the recreational and residential opportunities afforded by the creative city. The creative class would therefore appear to be deceptively classless, a broad category of individuals whose work involves creating new ideas, technologies, or creative content that resemble Landry's conceptualization of career workers, who apply creative thinking to solve problems across various industries, including public services, urban planning, and business. As egalitarian as this might seem, however, it supposes certain privileges only a select few has access to, most notably the freedom to choose for oneself where you want to live. On the one hand, the creative class have the luxury of not having to go where the jobs are. The jobs will follow them, as demonstrated by the fact that creative industries have been known to relocate to cities that are home to the largest percentage of creative labor force. On the other hand, the class is mobile and empowered, a kind of migrant labor force not attracted not to jobs but to place, vibrant places. In the creative economy, the market is determined above all by the quality of the public domain. It, it offers both safety, countless possibilities of transgression. It is imagined as a place of tolerance, diversity, vibrancy, entertainment, and countless network opportunities. It is a place where creativity flourishes and money flows. The creative class or career workers have thus become the motoring force of economic development based on the creative economy, of which the creative industry, the arts, design, and media, is but one sector. Florida's and Landry's models therefore consider various forms of cultural production, such as design, film, entertainment, music, computer games, as a direct way to attract and foster economic growth, a magnet for urban affluence and prosperity. It is within this model that we can speak of the commoditization of culture, the paradoxical yet powerful combination of commodity and creative singularity or individuality. As we've seen, the impoverished notion of creativity operative in this model is one limited to a specific sector with a matching class, of which the spatial needs can be determined empirically. The predominant belief, therefore, is that creative urbanity can be fostered or manufactured ex nihilo if needed. This often entails far-reaching governmentally steered top-down planning interventions, and in its most extreme form can take on grotesque shapes, unashamedly displaying its spectacular artificiality. Hudson Yards in New York City is no doubt exemplary in this regard. A handful of glass shard-like skyscrapers, seven-story gigantic shopping mall and art center, all designed by big-name architects, superimposed on a dozen gritty acres of working rail tracks, a nowhere land in the on the far west side. According to architecture critic Michael Kimmelman, it is at heart a supersized suburban-style office park with a shopping mall and a quasi-gated condo community targeted at the 0.1%. Nearly devoid of urban design, he continues, it declines to blend into the city grid and lacks any semblance of human scale, seemingly oblivious to the fact that architecture without urban design is just sculpture, and that the success of a neighborhood and its retail businesses comes down to what's happening at street level. With its focus on the building's shiny envelopes, on the monotony of reflective blue glass, and the sheen of polished wood, brass, leather, marble, and stone, Hudson Yards glorifies a kind of surface spectacle, as if the peak ambitions of city life were consuming luxury goods and enjoying a smooth, seductive, mindless materialism. It is the epitome of the neoliberal myth that private development is the truest measure of urban vitality and health, and money a city's only real currency. This $25 billion architectural development promises to be a wellspring of future tax revenues by offering grade A office and apartment space. Already the who's who of top-end knowledge economy firms and corporations have or plan to move in. While city officials sold Hudson Yards to New Yorkers as a self-financing venture, the city and state poured billions of public dollars into an extension of the number 7 subway line and into acres of open space around the yards. Investments presumably benefiting everyone, with the project is supposed to pay back by increasing New York's GDP. So far, however, the project is merely shifting economic development from other neighborhoods to Hudson Yards without creating new net worth. Projects such as Hudson Yards are primarily geared towards the revalorization of prime urban land. Urban geographer Eric Swinggedow explains that investment in the restructuring of developed urban areas or the production of new built environments revalorizes, at least potentially, the monetary value of the land and the built environment, benefits that are almost always reaped by the private sector. The financial and economic viability of these projects that depend on the future realization of the produced increased urban rents. The majority of the development or restructuring costs incurred is supposed to be covered by the sale or renting of the land or buildings, the value of which has been inflated through state support, deregulation, zoning changes, infrastructure investment, and the like. Their dependence on rent returns invariably means that they target the high-income segments of the population. This, in turn, exacerbates the problem of social segmentation and exclusion, and often leads to the creation of islands of wealth in an impoverished environment. The city consequently mutates into a hotspot of socioeconomically highly diversified and more mutually exclusive areas. Such large-scale urban restructuring and gentrification projects also foreground the undecidedly undemocratic nature of prevailing urban politics, since they have largely replaced statutory urban planning. Suspension of the latter permits the former to effect rapid rezoning, functional transformation, and accelerated implementation. Creative cities are advised to opt for planning through urban projects as primary means to fuel economic growth and to organize innovation. According to Swinggedow and Kaika, the large emblemic project has emerged as a viable alternative, allegedly combining the advantages of flexibility and targeted actions with tremendous symbolic capacity. Essentially fragmented, this form of intervention goes hand in hand with an eclectic planning style where attention to design, detail, morphology, and aesthetics is paramount, often solidified through the use of international icons of signature architecture. The emblemic project captures the deus ex machina, the unexpected power of creativity to save a seemingly hopeless urban situation. It becomes the symbol of new, restructured, revitalized metropolis, signaling innovation, creativity, and global competitive success. As such, these projects are invariably platforms for profound power struggles and position taking of key economic, political, social, and cultural elites. These projects are engineered to embody the ambitions of a particular set of local, regional, national, and sometimes also international players that determine, through the exercise of their socio-economic, cultural, and political power, the respective developmental courses of the urban areas. Instead of triggers for democratic urban empowerment, as the proponents of the creative city formula would argue, they instigate exclusion, inequality, and social injustice. In other words, as elite playing fields on which an urban future is engineered in line with the aspirations of the most powerful segments of those involved, they foster a fundamentally undemocratic and exclusive urban environment in which the economic, political, and fiscal interests of the powerful takes precedence over the resident low-income population that suddenly find themselves faced with imminent evacuation. The coalitions of elite actors, their periodic struggles for inclusion in or exclusion from decision-making view, along with structural socio-economic changes, are jointly responsible for shaping the fortunes of urban environments, as they determine who has the right to affordable housing, access to services, to land, etc. Moreover, while traditional socio-democratic redistribution channels flows from the haves to the have-nots, the present neoliberal flows redirect the flow towards real estate developers and the new creative economic agents. Apart from this direct model, it is also possible to distinguish an indirect model. The indirect model, as theorized by the Dutch urban planning consultancy office, Urban Unlimited's 2004 report, The Shadow City, maintains that the presence or vibrancy of a creative class is not the decisive factor for a creative city. Rather than the creative class that is thoroughly integrated into the formal economy, of decisive importance are the various creative forces that operate in the margins, interstices, or outside the formal economic circus. The surplus value of these informal career workers cannot wholly or at least exclusively be measured in economic terms. Their contribution to prosperity should rather be measured in terms of the general feeling of urbanity that it fosters. That is a tolerant, creative, dynamic, and innovative living environment. It is precisely this immaterial and immeasurable quality that is decisive for the economic viability of the formal sector of the neoliberal city. According to this model, strong creative urban environments are generally not the product of excessive governmental interventions, but rather the result of spontaneous bottom-up urban evolution. Contrary to appearance, this model does not advocate a laissez-faire approach to planning, but is far more dialectic. Although it avoids the structural organization of free zones or breeding grounds and the bureaucratic formalization that is concomitant with subsidies, it propagates indirect or negative planning measures responsible for the creation of those conditions potentially conducive to a creative urban environment. The indirect model is consequently much more subtle and unobtrusive in its planning measures and thoroughly aware of the precarious nature of such interventions. Important in this model is the availability of niche space, the possibility of improvised self-organized networks, affordable rent and living costs, and high social and cultural tolerance. Although it is important that the parallel universe remains insulated from the formalized economy, it serves as a vital incubator for fresh blood and innovative ideas upon which the formal creative economy feeds in time of need. Of importance is the art of safeguarding and optimizing this crucial synergy between the shadow zones and the formal creative economy that operates in the spotlight. Sociologist Saskia Sassen in The Global City likewise acknowledges the coexistence of the formal creative knowledge economy, the so-called producer services, and small-scale informal and experimental creative industries that operate in the margins of the formal economy while functioning as a breeding ground or incubator for the latter. However, instead of merely stating the parallel system of mainstream and underground as mere matter of fact, as Urban Unlimited does, she problematizes the injustices of the parasitic system, the high level of self-exploitation in the informally organized shadow economy, and the precarious work and living conditions of the career workers. Examples of the self-exploitation of the overworked and underpaid human batteries that fuel the creative economy include all those young architectural apprentices at the architectural offices such as OMA, eager to man Rem Koolhaas's firm completely free of charge, grateful to learn from the master himself. Equally exemplary is Dieter Lesage's acquiescent digitariate of translators, programmers, web designers, writers, editors, and researchers, busying themselves in the margins of the metropolis with all kinds of odd, mostly freelance jobs on offer in the informal economic circuit. Not unlike the proletariat, the digitariat hardly owns anything except their computers with internet connection. Urban Unlimited therefore depart from a romanticized conceptualization of the artist, for whom precarity, flexploitation, cutthroat competition, and suffering brought on by the self-responsibilization are necessary conditions to actualize and optimize their creativity. All conditions that Bourdieu identifies as interrelated characteristics of neoliberalism. Together, direct and indirect model permeates the entire register of power of the creative city, from macro-political urban interventions to the microphysics of the individual career worker. Based on the examples cited so far, we are beginning to suspect that the celebrated creative city formula is no more than the active implementation of what Bourdieu calls the dystopian reality of the neoliberal utopia of unlimited exploitation. The direct model is unapologetically neoliberal in its intent to generate economic surplus value, while impervious to the deleterious effects on urban life that follow in its wake. Gentrification leads to cultural and social homogenization and the displacement of long-time residents and small businesses, unable to afford the increased costs of living and operating in the area. Since neoliberal urban development prioritizes private investment and real estate interests over the needs of existing communities, socioeconomic inequality is exacerbated through selective urban revitalization of areas with high potential for economic return. Public funding is invested in luxury developments. So, AI is listening. Sorry about that. Where was I? Public funding is invested in luxury developments that largely benefit private interests, while more pressing needs such as affordable housing and public services are neglected. Emblematic projects such as the High Line has led to the commercialization and commodification of public space, turning it into an exclusionary space that caters to the needs of tourists and affluent visitors rather than serving the broader public. This is accompanied by increased private management, surveillance, and regulation, which limits free expression and spontaneous democratic use of public space. Economic growth and global competitiveness are prioritized over social equity and inclusivity. Apart from being emblematic of the neoliberal trophy architecture that prioritizes spectacle and iconic design over human-scale community-oriented urbanism, Hudson Yards development is often cited as an example of corporate welfareism, where the government provides financial incentives to large corporations and developers, often with little return to the public. The direct model's usurpation of cultural production, creativity, and even counterculture, traditionally conceived as notions that resist straightforward instrumentalization for commercial capitalist ends, therefore fails to engender the ideal urban rejuvenating climate of tolerance, diversity, and openness that Florida and Landry envisioned. This model then would appear to suffer from two inherent theoretical contradictions. First and foremost, the fact that the idea of the creative class seems to undermine the very breeding grounds needed for their inception. More specifically, it's anything but clear how the creative class is primarily individual, familial, and virtual ways of living and production can and will lead to the promotion of social tolerance, cultural diversity, or alternatively, the strong state it needs to implement these conditions. In the second place, and related to the first, is the creative economy's focus on consumption rather than production. This seems to lead to an ever-widening socio-economic fissure and increased spatial segregation that once again present a serious threat to the conditions of possibility of this creativity. The indirect model seems to be more able to avoid these contradictions, since it postulates a distance between the informal and formal economies, between marginal and mainstream urban processes. It would therefore also appear to be more promising in terms of fostering the desired open, diverse, and tolerant urban climate. The upside of this model is that creative urban environments and cultures that operate in the margins maintain the possibility to contest, counter, or soften the negative effects of neoliberalism because of their outside position. The downside, however, is that as incubators of creativity, they are vulnerable to self-exploitation and usurpation. What if, for example, it is precisely these contestations of marginal non-profit activities that enable the global creative elite in the formal economy to stay in power? If resistance can only come from within, as Foucault theorized, and if within is permeated by an aggressive capitalist order, does this model not incapacitate the informal career worker's ability to resist by firmly placing him or her outside of this order? Once outside, however, the informal career worker becomes part of the formal creative class, whose creative interventions are subject to the neoliberal rationality of a cost-benefit calculus. The potential for resistance in this context depends on the extent to which the revolutionary potential of artistic or cultural practices can be maintained despite the complexity of creativity. As is clear in the case of the creative city, the more creative and therefore economically empowered, the tighter the neoliberal noose. For Bourdieu, the dystopian reality of the implementation of the great neoliberal utopia is evident not only in the poverty and suffering of a growing proportion of the population of the economically most advanced societies, the extraordinary growth in disparities in income, but also in the progressive disappearance of the autonomous worlds of cultural production, cinema, publishing, etc., and therefore ultimately of cultural products themselves. The reclamation of autonomy is reasserting the right to give the law to oneself. Strategically positioned points of resistance within that would open more possibilities for thought and action that defy the unanimity of acquiescence that the neoliberal utopia is in fact the best of all possible worlds. A recent example of the agency that creative workers wield is the 2023 strike of Hollywood writers, one of the longest in the industry's history, that brought productions to a halt, sending shockwaves across Los Angeles and beyond, affecting major studios such as Amazon, Netflix, Paramount, and Warner Brothers. As a result of the creative workers' strike action, a new 3-year agreement was reached, which was hailed as exceptional by the Writers Guild of America, with meaningful gains and protections for writers. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ayşe Gülcan, and I'm currently based in Institute for Regional Studies in Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. But previously, I was based in Istanbul, and I'm here to talk about what a Brazilian colleague of mine and I kind of coined or used as neoliberal authoritarian urbanism, and I will be mostly focusing on Istanbul and urban, or what we call neoliberal urban processes that happened in the city center of Istanbul. So can we move forward? No. Okay. So that doesn't move then. Okay. No, thank you. So I will briefly actually define or how we define neoliberal authoritarian urbanism, then what that is in Istanbul, and I will continue with two case studies, one in the historical center of Istanbul in Tarlabaşı Beyoğlu district, and the other one is an Ayazma Küçükçekmece, which is located in one of the former informal settlements in Istanbul. And then I will be making some concluding remarks and discussions. Can we... So from the analysis of political and economic aftermath of the 2008 crisis, mortgage crisis, some authors have developed this concept of called authoritarian neoliberalism based on the contemporary mechanisms of neoliberal governance that expresses a qualitative shift from the intrinsic illiberal propensities of neoliberalism. And through legal, coercive, and administrative mechanisms that limit the public dimension of the state and popular action or resistance, neoliberalism has remolded nation states as a political way to advance the new period of accumulation. So there is an escalation in the state's propensity to employ coercion and legal and extra-legal intimidation, imposing austerity measures, or restructuring the space towards protecting the pillars of neoliberal accumulation. So here, the concept we proposed in this particular paper, which is neoliberal authoritarian urbanism, NAU for short, establishes the relationship between this general dynamic and urban development. So neoliberalism generated a finance-led urban policy that reorganized urban space according to the interests of capital reproduction, as we all know. And state finance coalitions reshaped governance structures and conducted land reforms, implementing property rights. A multi-scalar dynamic promotion of special capital has emerged in which global finance, national state, and local governments were integrated in favor of the land privatization and the creation of financial assets based on urban development. So these phenomena obviously are quite still present in everywhere in the world, in every kind of cities that you go in the global north or the south, you will find them. But there have been some changes since the post-2008 crisis context, with an accentuation of coercion, we would say, in the imposition of market interests on urban space. The initiatives that sought to establish some degree of coordination of interest between capital accumulation and social reproduction, such as the deployment of community-based programs and shadow state initiatives to combat social exclusion, were replaced by increasingly coercive practices. So in this way, the neoliberal authoritarian urbanism concept especially proves important in discussing the urban in the background of a fusion of the interventionist developmentalist state with authoritarian characteristics on the one hand, and a neoliberal urban governance framework that promotes urban capital accumulation on the other. So in a way that in this context that we use it, you will see that authoritarianism or authoritarian tenets of governing and neoliberal urbanism fit quite well within each other when they are used by the capital elites, at least, or the transnational real estate elites. So this complex merging of authoritarian and neoliberal in the urban space is an important contribution for providing a more holistic perspective, in our opinion, in southern contexts for sure, but in some of the northern contexts as well. So in a way, what we are also were trying to explain as well was the ability to take and make space enables different powerful groups not only to win negotiations and control over space, but also to mold space through different practices. So David Harvey, in this case, actually adds that although Bourdieu refers to individualized processes, what he concepts as collective symbolic capital, linked to the urban spaces, express the competitive dynamics that now predominate cities. So in a way, the aim of Paris, Berlin, New York, Istanbul, or Sao Paulo is to raise their symbolic capital and increase their marks of distinction to better base their claims to monopoly rent-generating uniqueness. So a person or a group or states or again, a company's ability to use capitals allow them a privilege or advantage. The effects of such privilege is that it hides the exercise of power in self-interested choices and makes them look natural or reasonable in a way that would convey the idea that there is no alternative. And we are quite actually used to the phrase of there is no alternative. And in a field where space is at stake and contested, all forms of capital are very much connected to spatial power. This would also make sense as part of Lefebvre's notion of right to the city. Since this notion is unfulfilled when an uneven distribution of social power, social and power relations dominate or defines the city space. This also leads to a situation where the fate of the urban inhabitants is not determined by themselves, but rather by these concentrated social powers. This is the situation in many cities around the world, and spatial power is necessary to take, make, and dominate in the most literal sense. In many neighborhoods experiencing urban redevelopment, and even like the one that we saw in previous presentation, the Hudson Yards in New York, the new inhabitants come into a place or a neighborhood with resources at their disposal that make the existing ones do not or may not possess. And the former turn the area into something new. Hence, for example, in many contexts, that's called gentrification. So in a way, to make some comparisons between maybe Turkey and Brazil, that environmental attacks in Brazil or hundreds of deaths of coal miners in Turkey are just two examples of how authoritarian neoliberalism not only make things worse for the marginalized groups, but also pushes them further into despair. This is due to two distinct limitations of neoliberalism. It remains a class project that advances the interest of the financial capital primarily, and its economic policy does not meet the main social demands and expectations in terms of generating jobs and ensuring a minimum standard of welfare for most people. To this end, it's grounded on a new form of power organization, authoritarian neoliberalism, which represents a transformation of the normal operation of the capitalist state. This political form corresponds to the class relations of neoliberal capitalism. So in a way, especially in the global south, but I would argue in the global north to a certain degree as well, development then comes before political and ethical concerns or rule of law. It then becomes more understandable leaders such as Erdogan or Bolsonaro or Trump use and highlight their supposed developmental and economic achievements when faced with criticism of undemocratic practices. In the case of Turkey, these achievements usually include massive urban regeneration, infrastructure projects. However, it's been observed in the last decade or so, even when authoritarian developmentalism fosters high economic growth, it almost always falls short on addressing the needs of the vulnerable population and heavily relies on labor exploitation. In the Brazilian case, the post-2016 authoritarian rise has a distinct ideological basis, for example, that there is a denial of developmentalism in favor of fiscal austerity that was put forward by Bolsonaro, combined with dismantling of social and labor rights with restoration of patterns of labor and overexploitation. So I think we can move forward. With this, I hope I gave you an idea or brief idea of what we actually were thinking about when we were putting forward this concept. And I will be going to what it means, what neoliberal authoritarian urbanism means in Turkey. I'll be giving you a very brief information of the neoliberal era in Turkey. So neoliberal era in Turkey started in the 1980s, as opposed to the 1970s, as it started in the global north. And it started with the coup d'etat of 1980s, and following civilian government showcased characteristics that overlapped with the global patterns that focused on the increase of privatization and state subsidized strategies for capital accumulation. Starting from the early 2000s, this neoliberal structuring started to be embraced by the urban actors and policymakers as well. And this is when Justice and Development Party, aka AKP, comes into place, which is the ruling party of Turkey since 2002, gradually embraced a more authoritarian and divisive measures that were usually accompanied by a neoliberal decision that sought to increase capital accumulation and also to increase inequality within Turkey or different groups of different groups within Turkish society. So following from this, when AKP first came to power, actually they came with a democratic agenda through a term that they coined as conservative democracy. However, further democratization was never actually an essential part of the party's hegemonic project. Having said that, they also did not specifically had an authoritarian agenda as well. Their agenda was basically pragmatic and practical. So this means that they adopted various and even sometimes conflicting positions depending on the political landscape at the time. This is why during their first term, they mostly implemented more democratic policies with less military presence, some civil rights, some increase in gender rights or women's rights, even though their neoliberal and conservative project also existed alongside these projects. So as one of the scholars actually described, the contingent constellation of social forces that assigned the AKP to the role of bringers of democratization and liberalization. The relation that is formed in this way between the AKP and democratization derived then just from a relation of continuity, which formed a new link between task and agent. But in reality, this link never existed. This connection never existed. It was never AKP's real agenda to bring democratization or liberalization. And it was mostly restructuring the social and urban formation through their conservative and neoliberal policies. And when that was threatened, they did not refrain from oppressing what they considered to be the danger to their own projects or to their own agenda. So in a way, the above-mentioned neoliberal urban structuring of Istanbul happened through several national and macro level policies and national institutions. The most, I will only give you two of them. The first one is Mass Housing Development Agency, aka again TOKİ, which was founded in 1984 to facilitate low-cost, affordable social housing for the vulnerable population, which then rebranded by the AKP in early 2000s to carry out most of their large-scale urban regeneration and redevelopment projects in the squatter areas, in rundown historical inner city neighborhoods, and urban areas prone to natural disasters such as earthquake. The other important one, which I won't be mentioning through the cases as much, but I would like to put it there, is the Ministry of Urbanism, Environment and Climate Change, which emerged with the merging of two separate ministries in 2011, the Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Urban Planning. And in the recent years, they also added the climate change for the, to challenge certain climate threats that Turkey faces. And if I would like to continue with the next slide, please. Yes, this is the first case, Tarlabaşı Beyoğlu. I don't know if you've ever been to Istanbul, but the most touristic part of Istanbul is Beyoğlu, which has İstiklal Street, which is also the most touristic street, I would say, and the Taksim area. And if you're also familiar with the history a little bit, with the urban history, that's also where the Gezi Park protests happened in 2013. And the Tarlabaşı neighborhood is 5 minutes walk away from all those areas. So it's very prime real estate, to be honest. It is the cultural center of the city, and the neighborhood normally consists of, or used to consist of, 4- and 5-story historic buildings that date back to the 19th and 20th century. So during the 1980s, there was a construction of a Tarlabaşı Boulevard that isolated this neighborhood from the Taksim area, which actually led to its physical deterioration. And it became a sort of deteriorated neighborhood where mostly the highly stigmatized or neglected populations would go and settle just because it was cheaper and it was extremely central. So the area received in the 1990s, though, the area received also another form of wave of immigration. This time it was from the east of Turkey, mostly consisting of Kurdish citizens escaping from the military activities in the east of the country. Now there is still a Kurdish population that's lives in Tarlabaşı, and there's a very small Roma population, but it's mostly become a host to Africans and Syrian migrants and some sex workers, Syrian refugees, sorry. And this project, actually, you can see on this side, on the right side, or for me it's left, you can see what it used to look like, and you can see how it was being demolished when the project was first announced. And this is taken from 2020, where you can see that how the regeneration project happened and it was being built. And this is just a model from the project leaflet. What happened is that in 2005, with a law that was enacted that enables regeneration in historic areas, some parts of Tarlabaşı were declared as urban renewal areas that was invented to convert the buildings into hotels, shopping spaces, and residences. And this initial stimuli was actually by the local government expected to trigger a complete physical change for the whole neighborhood and a complete gentrification. So what they wanted to do, they wanted to start with a state-led gentrification process with this kind of residential commercial urban regeneration project, hoping that this will actually trigger another classical gentrification process for the rest of the neighborhood as well. Because the urban regeneration project was only built on 9 lots, and Tarlabaşı is much bigger than that. So people living in the area, though, that faced with pressure from the local municipality and the construction company to sell their buildings or flats for very low prices under the threat of expropriation, founded a neoliberal neighborhood association of homeowners and tenants to defend their rights. And in this district, the owners were aware of the high rent potential of their properties. And while the prices offered by the company were quite below the market value, they preferred to improve their properties on their own, and they wanted to receive the rent increases themselves, which was not allowed by the municipality because they kind of sold or promised the area to a construction company at the time. Right now, the project area is completely demolished and all the former inhabitants are evicted from the area. And this demolition started in 2008, lasted until 2013 or 2014. And according to some of the interviews that I conducted in the area at the time, between 2013 and 2020, the inhabitants reported being treated quite badly, being intimidated by the police and the local state. They were afraid of the police force that has been operating in the neighborhood, and their complaints were that the police was not working for them and against them. And one account that I remember from the interviews was that also this is a very predominantly, or was a very predominantly Kurdish area. What they would say that the police would just patrol the area at any hours of the day, and at sometimes they would take certain people into custody, what they would think as the Kurdish population, into custody, and sometimes those people without any kind of legal reasons could be jailed up to 6 months or a year, or in one case it was up to 16 months, and in the end they had to, the burden of proof remained on them to kind of prove that they were not guilty of fabricated crimes, basically. The idea behind was that intimidation of the population to the point that they would not become a problem for the construction company when the demolition and the construction started. So in Tarlabaşı, most of the resistance, as I said, happened through the neighborhood association, but it also happened through certain press conferences and gatherings organized by Chamber of Architects or urban planners or other activist associations or NGOs. And this legal resistance, and also took the form of a legal resistance when the homeowners and certain NGOs filed lawsuits against the project, saying that it's not for public interest, it's for the public of the capital class or the financial capital, which they in the end won. After 10 years or so, they won the lawsuits against the project, but again, this was such a supported project by the municipality, local municipality at the time, and by the ministry, so the national government, is that actually the project continued to the point that project still stands. People are completely evicted, the place is completely demolished, and Tarlabaşı 360 is the name of the project, is open for everyone so that they can purchase any kind of luxury flats that they would like. And these flats usually go for millions of dollars, because if you're buying property in this part of Istanbul, you're not actually operating with the Turkish currency, you're operating with dollars or euros. And it's the kind of money that, I mean, I don't have, but I know that people who live there don't have that kind of money as well. So we can continue, I think. Yes. This is the second area called Ayazma, Küçükçekmece, in Istanbul, which is this was a squatter area or former squatter area in Turkish Gecekondu area in Istanbul during the late 1970s and early 1980s. And it's located in the vicinity of two important industrial areas, which gives some idea as to why it was preferred at the time by the vulnerable working class as an appropriate residential area. In 2004, the area was designated as an urban regeneration area, and a project was prepared affecting the lives of 1,440 families, and Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality, which is Istanbul municipality, and there is another municipality, Küçükçekmece municipality, which is the provincial municipality, and TOKİ signed the protocol in 2004 to transform this area into a multi-family unit housing area and to demolish all of the informal settlements. So as it stands now, as you can see pictures on the right from the demolition and how it looked after the demolition. This is the model from the project area, and this is just how the residential units look right now. So in a way, this urban regeneration project or this residential unit was called My World Europe. This is what the area is called. My World Europe is constructed by a real estate developer called Ağoğlu, and it is turned into a gated community for the middle and upper middle class. Now, hopefully, if it works, I will show you an advertisement from My World Europe's construction, where it doesn't have any subtitle, but it's only a minute. So in this advertisement, he's actually promoting his housing project, saying that this is Ayazma. I'm building a new housing project here. 87% of the area will be green space. Your energy will cost less. There will even be a golf course. I would always dream of a garden for a flat on the 10th floor. Now I planned it and I will make it happen, because everybody in this country deserves to live in a good quality, beautiful home.
Ben Ali Ağaoğlu. Burası İstanbul Ayazma. Burada 3100 konutlu yeni bir yaşam merkezi kuruyoruz. %87'si yeşil alan olacak. İçinde golf sahası bile olacak. Hep hayal ederdim. 10. kattaki evin bahçesi olur mu? Yaptım, olacak. Çünkü bu ülkede herkes havuzlu, güzel, kaliteli bir evde oturmayı hak ediyor. Burada havuzlar olacak. Bir tanesi tam 130 metre. Burada meydan var, mağazalar var. Her şey var. Burada bir yaşam var. Burası enerjisini kendi üretecek. Elektriğiniz %20 daha ucuz olacak. Bu yeni projemizde 10 bin lira peşinat veren herkes daire sahibi olacak. İnşaata başladık bile.
Ağaoğlu My World Europe. 10 bin peşin, daire senin.
So obviously, even though in the advertisement he says everybody in this country deserves to live in a good place, he doesn't really mean everybody. And the neighborhood was demolished between the years of 2004 and 2007. And most families left during this time, willingly or unwillingly, they left. But 18 families stayed behind, and these families constructed their own sheds on the demolished area and lived there for 2 years, enduring the harsh climate conditions. And during these 2 years, they were constantly living under demolition pressure and in very unhealthy conditions. In 2007, their sheds were demolished again on the grounds of the start of the construction of the urban transformation project. These 18 families, around 100 people, once again homeless, started to live in tents in the project area, and the situation continued for another year, with the lives of the families just deteriorating even further. In 2008, their tents were demolished again, and the families started camping outside the Küçükçekmece provincial municipality and demanded that they should have designated a place in the mass housing units somewhere in Istanbul, so a social housing unit basically for purchase for these people, but their applications were denied. And in the end, before the start of the official construction by Ağaoğlu, TOKİ agreed to house these families in the mass housing units and accepted to pay their rent for the duration of 1 year. And following that, the families would start paying a cheap mortgage to the TOKİ and become social housing homeowners. And however, in 2010, it became clear that TOKİ did not keep its promise to these families, informed them there was not going to be any housing units for them to purchase through the cheap mortgage scheme, and they forcefully evicted these families from the mass housing units where they were living as tenants. And obviously these people did not have title deeds because this was an informal settlement to begin with, so most people did not have proper title deeds in the start of the demolition anyway. But as you can see that these 18 families who resisted much more radically to claim their right to shelter and right to city were seen as a nuisance. But at the same time, if I have to put on an academic perspective, is that their resistance and urban resistance seems remarkable, right? It's the kind of urban resistance against authoritarian neoliberalism or urban regeneration projects that we would like to see. But at the same time, I would have to say that their resistance started and continued purely out of necessity, simply because they did not have anywhere else to go. If they had anywhere else to go, they wouldn't have resisted that much. And in the end, the resistance kind of failed anyway. So in a way, I have to make some theoretical or more abstract remarks on neoliberal authoritarian urbanism. The actors involved in the disputes can be organized at different levels: population of the affected areas, market players, municipalities, state authorities, the justice system, the national state, and the real estate investment funds and funding agencies. And in the case of Istanbul, the authoritarian developmentalism and accumulation by dispossession are the two important concepts that highlight processes of authoritarian urbanism, as it is described through the two urban regeneration and renewal projects: the increasing financialization of the housing market and the blatant disregard for the vulnerable urban population through more oppressive practices showcase how global capital can selectively engage with authoritarian or more politically closed nationalistic environments that do not correspond or fit into the neoliberal governmental setting due to the promotion of entrepreneurial individual in the neoliberal rationalities. It's been argued so many times that nationalism and neoliberalism should not be thought as conflicting ideologies. They actually fit quite well in certain contexts. Can we go to the last slide? So the urban projects and decisions that have a direct impact in the urban space allows us to clearly understand how national and local governments can pursue a grossly neoliberal agenda and show how free market can mean not less state, but on the contrary, more authoritarian and oppressive practices, and how they can enjoy these kind of practices while furthering their own agenda. The specialized perspectives highlight the transformation in the state intervention with an accentuation of coercion and loss of social legitimacy, while also selectively engaging with neoliberal politics and policies. Also shows how globalization and the reach of transnational capital is state-crafted. Moreover, the various ways in which state power is spatialized, as well as how the state implements quite diverse policies in different areas, compels us and researchers, academics, activists, and maybe all those citizens to reconsider authoritarianism and democracy and freedom and control. So that will be the end of it. Thank you.
Let's go again. What is your impression when you compare these two presentations as a different topics and the same morphology?
I can say something about the High Line and that whole project in New York. For one reason, because my father used to work in one of the meat packing companies that was underneath the High Line. So a few times that I visited him at the place where he worked, there was this abandoned railway structure that covered the one whole section of like the west side of Manhattan. and it was basically abandoned. But there was a whole process of like slow development and change that basically was connected to like the artistic communities that were in that area, because there was right near the beginning of the High Line, the lower southern part of the High Line, there was an abandoned structure by the telephone company, okay? And this structure, maybe it was like 10 or 12 stories, was then turned into artistic housing, okay? It became low income housing for artists that didn't exist in most of Manhattan, okay? So this, in some sense, became a certain kind of magnet, okay? Also, there was another important structure that was created in conjunction with the High Line, which was the Whitney Museum, okay? So the Whitney Museum moved from its location in Midtown Manhattan to basically the southern part of the High Line, okay? And so what emanated from this was like a movement basically to convert this abandoned railway structure into some kind of public space, okay? So the movement was not motivated by real estate developers. It was basically motivated by artists and other kind of like community activists that wanted to change this structure that was basically a non-place, okay, into something that became like a public space, okay? And as they fought for many years to be able to do this, okay? And finally it became successful, and the project developed, and I mean, the times that I walked on the High Line, you know, from the beginning, it was like it had this kind of like exhilarating atmosphere, because it was a public space that was not controlled by anyone, really, okay? It was like just a public space that didn't exist previously. I'll just say one other point, okay, about the Hudson Yards, okay? You saw in one of Benda's photographs this like sculptural like element that was created there, okay? This was like a structure that was like created so that people could walk up to the top of the structure, okay? As like kind of a living sculpture, sort of, okay? What happened? It became a magnet for suicides, okay? People would climb up to the top and jump off, okay? And there was basically no precautionary measures that were placed on the structure to prevent people from doing that. So they had to close it, okay? Because it was like a suicide magnet, you know? It was like people jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. So, and this piece was part of like the central element in this whole Hudson Yards project. Plus this kind of like mall that they created. And I have to tell you, I visited this mall, and it was like walking into kind of a dystopia, you know, a consumer world. It was like one of the most horrifying spaces that you can imagine. But this was all part of like this kind of commodification of the High Line, okay, of the project, a project which attracted people because it was a dynamic public space, and then became like a way that that the real estate developers thought that they could like exploit in terms of like drawing people to the shopping mall.
This is a very interesting evolution, I think, this case example. what originally started as a real newly created public space with all its potential is reversed into a commodified product in the end. And this is one aspect. The other aspect is when we compare it to pre-modern cities, for instance, for instance, Italian cities, as regards public buildings and the magnificence and art they put in public buildings. When this former direction of making it public, a piece of art, vanishes in favor of making a sculpture, and a sculpture of whom? This is the sculpture of the individual architect, okay? And then who will benefit from this sculpture when you compare it, for instance, with a pre-modern city like Siena, where we have a campo, a central place, where all the citizens can participate in the artwork of this place. It's a very rude comparison, but I think sometimes we need these clear-cut and brute comparisons as a what has happened when there is a process of commodification plus of expressing the individual ego of the respective architect.
I'm also just going to read out what Jason commented. So, continuing this conversation on the High Line, it can be seen as an impetus for moving New York out of a lowest common denominator developer-dominated city without inspiration or artistry. But now the High Line shows the fragility of a moment of urban vitality that was a benefit to the city and now is a place of overwhelming consumption.
Yeah, no, I mean, I haven't ever visited the High Line, but I was just sort of thinking a bit about, I mean, thanks to both speakers as well. I really enjoyed presentations, but on the notion of the creative class, I think there's been some research done, critical research done. I'm thinking here of somebody like Sharon Zukin's work from a number of years ago, where she's showed, and I think other people have showed, how unintentionally a sort of creative bohemian class can unintentionally and not particularly want to do it, but will help to gentrify an area. So you have in New York, what Zukin wanted to show is that how when the industrial lofts there in many parts of New York were vacated and a more bohemian class moved in, and artists and so on, over years they made it very trendy, the area in the end. And then, of course, before you know it, developers are going in there, gentrifying and so on and so forth. We see that in London as well. There's areas, for example, in the East End, like Hackney, where you had a very strong artistic community in the 80s and 90s that then became sort of commodified much more. And then you had a movement called Brit Art, and a load of investors invested in Brit Art, and it really took off. And now Hackney is, I mean, the house prices there are sky high, but they live side by side, obviously, with people who've lived there for years who aren't part of that sort of elite community. But yeah, it's interesting how developers can very quickly commodify bohemian culture. Another early, very, very early example, I don't know if anybody remembers. I mean, I remember growing up, as I'm old enough, in the 70s, to see the old Coca-Cola advert of people, of hippies on a hillside singing, "I'd like to teach the world to sing," and they're holding bottles of Coca-Cola. And it's an early example, and this is about 1972, of a corporate entity commodifying peace and love, you know, and that sort of hippie dynamic, if you like, which a lot of corporations do. But anyway, just an observation.
Okay, we have one more conversation to finish. So, King's Cross, London is an interesting case. Is it neoliberal or a place for urban community? And then
I know it's a bit, well, I mean, it's the main train station in London, and it used to be, it's recently had a lot of development done to it. You know, if you go back 10, 20 years, it'll be an area which was very different culturally, where, you know, if you went around the areas, it would be, seemed to be what might be called, hadn't been really been developed, and it had lots of different communities there as well. Working class communities, very diverse communities. It was known as a sort of drug area, and now it's all been redeveloped. And it is an interesting case now because it's what's happened to those communities that were there. Are they still there? I mean, I don't know too much about it since then. It's only passing through on my way somewhere else. But yeah, no, it is an interesting case study.
This is a footnote, okay? Because the sculpture, this like monster piece that was at Hudson Yards, a year ago, I was visiting a park in Slovakia, okay? And the exact same piece that was at the Hudson Yards was in this park, okay, in Slovakia. I mean, the design was like almost exactly the same. It wasn't quite as high, but it was the same idea. And this piece, when you got to the top, there was like a slide that you could go down. You could go inside the slide and you would slide down. And it was like a place of, I don't know, it's like going to an amusement park or kind of thing. But nobody was jumping off of it, you know. And actually, Olaf Eliasson, the sculptor, created a piece at the Tate Modern where he had the slide that was like.
Oh yes, I remember this. Yeah.
At the top of in the Tate Modern, and people could go down the slide.
It's really popular.
It was really popular. Nobody died as a result of it.
Just sliding down is a popular issue, it seems.
One other thing, Richard Florida, who came up with the idea or wrote about the creative city, retracted it, okay? He said that a lot of the ideas that were part of like this whole concept of the creative city actually didn't work, you know? So, okay.
Yeah, this is important. This is to formulate it a bit ironically, it has been a positive academic dream, a small utopia that the creative city will solve the existing problems. And the point is, these approaches are incorporated in an existing system dynamics. We are speaking about in the symposium. There are no exceptions, at least for now, as regards the dynamics.